Hello and welcome to Architecture, Design, and Photography. Today, we are speaking with William Bill Leddy of Leddy, MAYTUM, STACY Architects in San Francisco, California. Bill has written a book called Practice with Purpose, a guide to mission-driven design. Before any further ado, let's just get into it. Please welcome William Bill Leddy of Leddy, MAYTUM, STACY Architects. All right, welcome to Architecture, Design, and Photography. William Bill Leddy, who goes by Bill, principal, I believe, at Leddy, MAYTUM, STACY Architects in San Francisco, California. And you've written a book, Practice with Purpose, a guide to mission-driven design. Now, if you could give us a little bit of background of yourself so people listening who don't know anything about you can kind of get a little bit of an idea of who they're listening to, and then what pushed you into writing this book.
Sure. So thanks, Trent. Happy to be on this podcast. Thanks for inviting me. I've been practicing architecture for almost well over 45 years now. And my firm, Leddy, MAYTUM, STACY Architects, reorganized back in 2020 to focus our efforts on work for nonprofit organizations who have missions that advance social justice, environmental equity, education, and those kinds of things. After sort of 23 years of doing this practice, we wanted to share some of the things that we've learned about the benefits of doing what we call mission-driven design. Our firm has been, won lots of design awards, and in 2017 we were the National AIA Firm of the Year. But I think a lot of that has been because of this focus on integrating great design and also issues that address, or buildings that address those issues: social justice, equity, environmental sustainability, the decarbonization of our built environment. The reason we decided to write the book was because we really do feel that we've come to a point, if anyone's paying attention to the news these days, where humanity, when I say we, are facing a sort of a combined sociological and ecological crisis, an emergency that really is unprecedented in the history of our species to this date, particularly when it comes to climate change. But I think we can't ignore the fact that climate change and social justice are intimately entwined. The people who are going to be feeling the impacts of, and are feeling the impacts of climate destabilization are typically populations of color, folks with limited means. And I think, what's occurred to us over all these years is that as architects, we are in a unique position to contribute to the solution of these problems. We all know that buildings represent a contribution of about 40% of greenhouse gases globally in terms of the construction of buildings that we build and design and build. And so we have an opportunity, and we think really kind of a moral obligation to step up and become leaders in our communities and help show the way to a just, climate positive future for everyone. I think what's led us to this has all led us to the conclusion that we really need to radically redesign the practice of architecture so that it's no longer business as usual. Making our clients happy is unfortunately not enough. And this is hard enough as it is right now, but it's not enough to make our clients happy. We have to design every single project that we work on has to be designed to go beyond its property lines and address some of these epic challenges that our communities face, and the resilience, um, rapid decarbonization, all of those things I've mentioned. And so we think that it's time for all of us to refocus our efforts in design. And it's also not enough to make beautiful buildings. Beautiful buildings are sustainable in themselves, but they have to be addressing these issues at the same time. So I think that's the idea behind the book. We wanted to share this particularly with younger architects, with students, with folks who might be feeling at a loss of what to do about their future, how to take action, and try to make a difference in every day that we work. And so I think this book is a way to sort of say, well, we can do this. We can actually step up as a profession and bring greater meaning and agency to our work every day by not just making beautiful buildings, not just designing on budget and on schedule, but also designing for the communities that we serve and to rapidly advance the decarbonization of the built environment.
So, in your vision for what a architecture firm should be and kind of its mission for personally running your firm and the people involved in it, have identified that your leaders in change, and that you're at the decision point of helping people choose between options and why they build, how they build, how much they're going to spend on the things that they put into their building, and help those people guide their decisions towards things that are raping the planet slightly less, and thinking beyond just the beauty of their immediate building, but also the impact that building has, not just visually beyond its boundaries, but where it pulls its resources from, what it does to the peoples in those countries, and also just all of the transportation, all the capturing of the raw elements and everything else, and how that happens to go into the products that are placed in the buildings, in the designs that you're ultimately responsible for. So you're, as an architect, you're essentially a hub of a lot of information passing hands, money passing hands, decision passing hands, and you're kind of like a trading post in the American frontier, in a way that you can guide these people along the way and be agents for positive change overall as it relates to our social environment, which are usually people that are completely left out of the architectural conversation because they just can't afford the services. But then also the decisions on how things are going to affect the environment, that seems to be now becoming, at its least, a highly discussed topic, and at its worst, an impending disaster that's going to take us all out. And where we find ourselves on that spectrum, regardless, the architect is at a central place of a conduit of all of those decisions and those processes and those conversations and everything. So there's a lot of responsibility imbued into the person acting as that agent for the owner in creating a design. And you've rightly responded to your conscience to say we want to be more than just creating beauty for a client. We want to think beyond the client's needs and make sure that we're acting in good faith towards our public overall and our environment overall. Would that be a good kind of encapsulation of where you're at as a firm and the drive behind this book, if I'm understanding it correctly?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that what we have to understand is that buildings have an impact on the people that use them,
and don't get to use them.
and also people that don't get to use them. I mean, I think the point here is that we're at a fundamental shift in the history of our species from away from oil and fossil fuels to a whole range of other solutions that are less damaging to our environment. And I think a lot of people are nervous. A lot of people are afraid. You know, we're used to this unlimited amounts of energy to this. We're used to this unlimited amounts of consumer goods that we can purchase and fill our lives with. But at the end of the day, I think what architects offer is are kind of a billboards through their buildings of what a zero carbon future can look like. And I think what people will find is that it's actually in many ways much more humane, slower. It brings people together. It brings us together with the natural world. And I think it also helps to serve the full sort of width and breadth of our society. You know, a lot of what we do, the different kinds of work that we work on, each have a context in that way. So in the case of the book, we designed it to be 5 chapters. The first and probably the most important we feel is climate action, because if we don't get that right, everything else becomes far more difficult in the coming years. The second chapter deals with equity, and because the equity is again part of the sort of emergency that we're all facing, and trying to make our society more equitable. The third is housing. Housing is absolutely a human right, and we work exclusively with nonprofit housing developers, designing homes for formerly homeless folks, formerly homeless veterans, super low income families. All of those folks that have been left behind, they get to have housing. They get to have architecture. Architecture is really for everyone. The fourth chapter is about education. Education is absolutely key, because we need to be preparing the next generations for this rapidly changing planet that we're living on, and how can they thrive and live fulfilling lives in the future, where so much is evolving. And finally, I think the last part, which is really key, I think, is adaptive reuse of existing structures. There's no more sustainable building than the one that's already built. And a lot of the conversation around sustainability these days is not even so much, health, which is very important, but that's kind of easy to take care of at this point with all the products that we have at our disposal. It's really both operational carbon, the carbon that buildings use during their lifetime, but maybe even more importantly right now in the next 10 years, embodied carbon, which is the carbon emissions that come from creating all the materials, creating the construction, doing, shipping all the materials across the globe in some cases to build buildings. And so what we can do in the case of adaptive reuse is we can create new buildings out of existing structures, and thereby save as much as 70% reductions in carbon emissions when compared to a new building of the same size. So all of these things, all of these 5 elements are various approaches to this global emergency that we're all facing. And I think it's because we feel this is important, because buildings, as I say, are kind of billboards for the future, and each building casts a pebble in the pond, and the ripple effect goes out, and we have no way to predict how that happens. That's one reason why we like doing schools, because if you create a school that's strongly connected to the natural world and connects students to each other and to learning and to the changing seasons, then they learn to live in this sort of post-carbon world. Their parents observe that it's nothing to be afraid of, and they can and embrace it, and we can accelerate the this transition that we're currently involved in to a much faster pace that needs to really happen if we're going to reduce really calamitous problems in the future.
So I'd like to touch on kind of the rubber meets the road of the challenges of our time as far as the climate emergency, racial and ethical injustice, chronic homelessness, and educational crisis. The third thing that I'm seeing that is, or third, 1, 2, 3, 4, fifth, that I'm seeing in the list that I just read off is kind of our polarization in our thinking and presentation of ideas and framing of those who oppose us as having bad intentions, where I think half of our population has more of a reference to what's established and the past as a means of keeping us from going off the rails. So this would be more of your conservative, conscientious half of the nation, and it is half. It's not a bunch of idiots that just voted for Trump, but there's a psychological, not split, but we're balanced in that we have to go outside of the boundaries to see where we can progress. And sometimes we go too far outside, and sometimes we go just the right amount. Sometimes we don't go enough. And so there's part of our population that kind of has the reins in its hands, trying to pull us back in some sense. And then there's another half of our population that's kind of giving them a slap and saying, come on, we've got to get moving. The climate crisis is real. People are dying because of the inequity and everything else. We've got to progress and make change. So the idea that I try and do as much as possible in these conversations is to really look at the presentation of solutions, but also try and look at the dissenting opinion and why they might have some ground, but also how to answer those questions to be able to bring the dissenting opinion closer to your opinion, if there's a logical and rational reason to do so, which hopefully brings us together and makes progress that much more of a real, reliable, and lasting thing that eventually becomes a thing that the conservative people take over and say, we established this back in the 2020s and it's great and we're protecting it now in 3,000, whatever it is someday. But with the climate crisis, I feel like people who are listening to this are going to have a pretty open-minded disposition to begin with, I would think, if they're in the design community, photography, architecture. So I don't think there's much of a convincing of people listening to say there are real issues that we have to start designing into our buildings, the sourcing and the use and the specking of things that has a better carbon sequestration and everything else for the building, the shipping and everything else. It's becoming a foregone conclusion and something that's obvious that is not that much in question anymore. In my opinion, I could be totally wrong on that, but I'd like to focus on how architecture and the process of architecture can actually help, can have lasting change and help the racial and ethnic and resource inequality and injustice that we have today. How do we practice architecture to help bring society to more of an equitable state?
Well, you raise some really great points, Trent. I think the divisions in this nation are real, and we're not going to solve, half the country is not going to solve the problem for the entire country. We have to find common ground in some areas. And I think, just to answer your first question relative to that, I think the issue of community resilience is kind of to your point, kind of where the rubber meets the road. We're seeing, towns throughout the West and the South, in the Midwest, across the country being inundated by floods that are unheard of. We're seeing amazingly powerful tornadoes that are popping up in places that aren't, certainly they're popping up in places that are used to tornadoes, but there are also places that are not so used to tornadoes, and causing enormous amounts of damage. I think that what has to happen is that we have to understand this is not a left wing or a right thing. It's not a Democrat or Republican thing. It's for all the people, and I think we can find common ground, if on no other basis than, look, the climate is changing. At some point, we have to sort of look at the science and say, okay, what is the science telling us? The science is telling us that we have to decarbonize rapidly. I think that's the second point that I want to make here. People don't really understand, I think, the urgency of this issue. I think that when we say, well, we have, even folks who are in the design professions, well, we have, the codes are getting really tough, and we've got, LEED, and, we've got that, all done. We're good. We're good to go. Well, the fact of the matter is we're not. Unless we can, as one of my heroes, Ed Mazaria of Architecture 2030 says, we have to basically make every single building net zero energy as rapidly as we possibly can. In other words, within the next 7 to 10 years, and that's a huge undertaking, as you might imagine. So part of the reason for this book was to try to help mobilize all of the creative minds in our profession to think more avidly about these issues, to not accept the notion that, that green thing, it's kind of boring, I think it's more the opposite. It's more, let's embrace this as integral to design excellence in the 21st century. That fact that if a building is beautiful, that's wonderful. But if it's beautiful and it also is sitting lightly on the earth and keeping its occupants safe and healthy in a changing planet, then it's an even greater, deeper beauty than simply visual or experiential beauty. So I think all of that, is really key. And then finally, I think that if we can convince our communities that to achieve resilience, we need to start to think about more energy independence. Texas is plagued by grid failures.
They have a private grid system there, or?
It's as much as I know about it, it's a complicated mixture of separate little grids that have a tendency to kind of fall apart when there's great stress, particularly in severe heat. So what does that mean? It means that we have to start relying more on microgrids of renewable energy, that makes sense. And I think you're seeing that being adopted more and more in rural parts of our country. It's just the question of, well, is it happening fast enough? And so I think what we're trying to do with this book is sort of do a couple of things. One is to sort of say, well, look, here's a way that we think we could help to enlist the combined creativity of architects and designers across the country to think more rigorously on every project about this, and at the same time, as I said earlier, provide a lesson of hope to young architects and students who are entering the profession now and wondering, how do I have a career that has any meaning when the world is falling down around my ears? So I think that's the key. And I don't know if I've answered your question, but remind me if help me
Sure.
focus in on that.
Initially the discussion around climate, to personally, to me, it's already yeah, of course we need to be making decisions that are not going to be harming the planet, and to really wonder if humans can affect the environment. I mean, just look at what we did with leaded gasoline and how quickly that was an issue by us, for us, by us. And we pulled up from that, but humans don't really have the tendency to change their behavior until it's a very threatening situation en masse. And I feel like we're getting to the point where we understand we do have to start making the choices that reduce our carbon footprint, reduce our, adding to the greenhouse potential effects and everything else. So to me, that's personally something that I don't, it's not something I have a hard time understanding. When it comes to the inequality of racial, ethnic, and just resource inequality, and how we do that through the practice of architecture, how do we see housing as a human right? So if I'm standing in a camp that looks back in time to see what things should be, our conservative camp, if you will, they're going to say, well, you have to do it yourself. You have to pull up yourself by your bootstraps. There's all these kind of vernacular sayings that people fall back on. Say, look, we built this country on our own. We're not a social kind of country. We're more of a capitalist, more of an independent, slightly more libertarian, keep big government out of my life situation. And if I don't have a house, it's my fault, not someone else's fault. That's kind of one side of our country will think in those terms. On the other side, sorry, I'm getting pop-ups from Zoom here now. On the other side of our country, we're going to have an absolute housing is a human right, and people should not be dying of exposure, which, well, that's just a nice thing to want to do for people. There's nothing wrong with that. But the devil's in the details. If I have a child who refuses to work, but I continue to let them live in my basement until they're 35, am I doing them a favor? So it's not that you can simply say, I want the best for everybody, so I'll provide that, and that'll be the best long-term solution. That would be me kind of trying to see if I could throw a monkey wrench in that idea of using architecture to help solve the homeless crisis, the inequalities of ethnic and resourced populations being funded and given resources and taken resources from in an inequitable manner. How do we actually practice architecture to correct the homeless situation and the injustices within the world? How does that come to the rubber meeting the road in the practice of architecture?
Okay, well, I think first of all, I think housing, safe, supportive housing was designated by the United Nations decades ago as being a fundamental human right.
So what does that mean when they say that? Does that mean that the government has to provide a minimum for humans, or?
It means there's been lots of research on the fact that homelessness leads to mental illness and disease and all sorts of other challenges that we as a society have to deal with. In San Francisco, where I live, it costs an enormous amount of money, for example, if you want to put it in monetary terms, for the fire department to go out and respond to calls when some unhoused person gets in trouble on the street and needs to be taken care of, taken to the hospital. It's a huge amount of money, and there've been many economic studies that shows that if you take that same person who, has fallen down on their luck, and for whatever variety of reasons, it could be these days, could be a tech worker who's been laid off from,
Right.
from Google or whatever, and put them in and help them find a way to get stabilized, so they have a place to receive mail, and have a place to address that they can receive opportunities for employment. This is why, it's an old saying, when you help the least of us, you help all of us. And I think at the end of the day, what architects can do, I think, is you don't have to, do this on every single project, but I think it's just a few opportunities to sort of say, well, can I get involved in, helping to solve the homelessness crisis in my community? How do I do that? Well, it means getting involved with maybe local nonprofit developers who are helping to create housing for the formerly homeless. And these projects are, by the way, supportive housing projects typically, which means that, folks that get that live there also get support, medical care. They get job counseling. They get substance counseling. And it's an opportunity for them to take a breath. We just finished a project, I think, that's very inspiring over in Berkeley, called Berkeley Way. It's for Berkeley Food and Housing. And what they do there is it's a combination of a food program, so that anyone living on the street can come in and get a meal, a free meal. And once they're there, they can see that there are free services to take advantage of. There's healthcare, there's counseling, there's a whole variety of different things, and they meet people in their same situation, people who are down their luck, people who have for whatever reason, found themselves without a roof over their heads. Then the project also has interim housing for unhoused veterans. It's got housing for individuals, studio apartments for individuals who need a chance to get stabilized and kind of regain their footing in society. And then it's also got housing for low-income families. So it's sort of it's a range from providing food to providing basic shelter for these folks who just need to get off the street and get a chance to So I guess what I would say is, it's one thing for someone to walk through a city or even a small town and complain about homelessness. It's another thing to do something about it. And I think as architects, we are uniquely qualified and uniquely gifted to help do something about that. I think you're right. I think some people might say, well, that's not my problem. Well, yes and no. I think you look around and you see, people, living on the street, and you wonder, well, why don't they just take care of themselves? And of course, the answer is, well, for whatever variety of complicated reasons, they can't, and so it's up to us to help them. And once we help them, they become, hopefully, productive members of our society. And one of the things that I've always found shocking is that this is a fundamental, Judeo-Christian ideal, right? It's helping those who need help, and yet, some folks, who call themselves Christians also don't necessarily agree with that in every case. So I guess I'm just saying, let's look at it from a pragmatic perspective, not political. Let's just say, what can you do what can I do as an architect to provide greater inclusion? Another example of this is a project that we did some years ago now over in Berkeley, also in Berkeley, called the Ed Roberts Campus, which is Center for the Disability Rights Independent Living Movement. It's a 35,000 square foot community center and office building that's designed to welcome everyone regardless of their ability level. And this is a disability is something that spans across, as we know, spans across all races, all genders, all socio and economic circumstances. And so this is a way that architects can create environments that celebrate the full spectrum of the human condition by creating environments that welcome people, no matter what their situation is, no matter what their abilities are. And this project's been in service for 15 years now, and it's had a huge impact on many individuals who go there for a variety of services to help them deal with their whatever disability they're dealing with. So that's another example of how architects can address equity and inclusiveness in our environments just by thinking a little more broadly. Don't look at the ADA as an annoyance or just a bunch of trouble. Look at it as an opportunity to go beyond with what we call universal design, go beyond the ADA and create environments that are gracious, that invite people into that gracious environment that allows them to feel a measure of dignity and inclusion.
Here's the problem with the Judeo-Christian stance on anything, in my opinion, is that, well, you can reference the poor or the homeless, and on one hand, you have all the obvious things of taking care of the poor and giving to those in need. And then on the other hand, you have quotes like "the poor will always be with us," or "he who does not work will not eat." They have like both sides of the spectrum in there. So depending on where you fall on your psychological spectrum, that then kind of leads you towards a conservative or open side. You can kind of argue it one way or the other. So there's this pushback that I need to engage with, to be fair, to say just providing something is not enough. We have to know what it does to the human condition now you in the future. So you rightly pointed out, in my opinion, that the being homeless causes psychological breaks, and as soon as you get someone on a psychological break, a lot of times you're just not getting them back. Now, I just had a job in San Francisco in December, late December, and I had to leave early in the morning. My assistant didn't fly out until I think 12. He walked to the coffee shop from the hotel that morning. I think it was a Sunday. Stepped over someone on the street to go get coffee. On the way back, he realized the person he stepped over was dead. It's that pronounced in areas where it's, if you live in rural Maine, to a sense, like I do, you can kind of, you can be left insulated from all of that. But even like here in Portland, we have a pretty significant heroin and homeless problem, at least in the summer. And so I decided to go and interview a lot of these homeless people that were out panhandling, asking for money, because I had heard that there was kind of a homeless mafia, if you will, that controlled the street corners, that only certain people, and then they had to give a cut of blah, blah, blah. And I'd heard that rumor. So I decided, well, I'll go talk to him, see what the deal is. And in talking to them, there's no homeless mafia. There's nothing like that. But the thing I did find is that it all broke down to basically three issues for homelessness that were major identified causes in the people in Portland that I talked to, maybe four. One of them was just medical needs. They'd run into medical issues and they'd just be out of their house. Most people are a couple steps away from losing their ability to be housed.
Right.
And when you have a medical system that, well, you pay this amount, so you don't get to keep all four fingers, you got to pick one kind of system. You get real issues there. And that's an overall greed of the nation to allow us to be left in that kind of situation, in my opinion, that pushes me towards more of a left-leaning socialized medicine kind of thing. Right side of the conversation is going to freak out about that and would not want to go there with you. But the next thing I found was that drug addiction was just absolutely probably the biggest issue and the most pressing issue for death with the people that we talked to. The third was, primarily psychological issues, which can be enhanced by medical issues, drug issues, and homelessness. The fourth thing I would include in there is just simply bad policy. So the thing that we did is we interviewed in downtown Portland these people, and they pointed out to us that most of the people here are dope sick on heroin, and you can go to a treatment center down in this one block. They have a methadone clinic, they have a place where you can sleep, and they have kind of a cafeteria, if you will. And the actual people that we interviewed are pointing out to us, I can go here for a week and they'll get me over my dope sickness, but they won't get me over the behavioral norms that I have and the people I'm around, that as soon as they let me out of that building, which is on the same block as all the services, as soon as they let me out of that building, I'm with all my friends in the same situation who are still using. I'm going to sleep in the same place. It's just absolutely hopeless for them in that situation, not having money or enough family with money to get them completely out of there. And even the people we were interviewing were saying, why don't they have these, for one, get us past just the dope sickness issue? It's got to be a longer period. It can't work. You're right back into the system. Why don't they have us out in more of a rural area and more of a rehab situation where we're working in gardens and learning processes of life and care and everything else, and have the ability to engage with a 12-step program or something else. And then one guy that we interviewed had already died 7 times, and they had brought him back. The system that was set up, it was just massively letting these people down. Now, it was an effort, and they weren't out in the cold. They were not dying that night, which you can do here in Maine if you're left outside in exposure. It's bad. But all the emphasis and everything else was there, but it's just, it felt like a token thing. It's just not solving the problem. And the thing that solves the homeless problem in Maine is the winter. They get on a bus and they go to Florida. Because it's, $49 or whatever. Get on a bus and you go to Florida for the winter. Now, that's not a real solution. And simply giving people with these behavioral tendencies, at least the homelessness starts to push those tendencies. The drug addiction is extremely hopeless, especially in the heroin realm. And then the mental issues, it's absolutely hopeless. And to give them a safe place to stay that's warm when they're drug addicted and mentally ill is almost as bad as just putting them in prison, because they're going to be imprisoned by their own devices at that point. But what's the other option is to just simply let them die of exposure. That's heartless. We can't do that. How do you have any experience or policy issues that have been successful and shown like really good results in the practice of architecture to actually feed into that?
Yes, I mean, I think the system that San Francisco has a huge homelessness problem, as you probably are aware, and I think in our case there's no winter to force people to go down to LA. So
you've got fog. That's about it.
Yeah, we've got fog. But I think what happens here is that I think is very successful and has been shown to be very successful is that when you take a group of people who are unhoused, and often they've created tight knit little communities on the street, and you bring those folks indoors into a supportive environment, as I mentioned earlier, that provides some of these services that for free, and a warm place to be, we have lots of research that shows that many people, not all, but many people respond very positively to that opportunity to get clean, to become part of continue to be part of a community that is made up of friends that they've made over a period of time, and to live in a more healthy environment. One of the greatest quotes that I've heard about this situation is that we do after we complete a project, any project, but mostly the affordable housing projects that we do. We go back and do a post-occupancy evaluation, and we interview the staff, and we interview the residents. We try to find out what we got right, what we got wrong.
And this was a homeless shelter, essentially, unhoused shelter project.
It's in San Francisco, the hotel tax fund and a bunch of other funding sources pay for these projects that are built to provide supportive housing for unhoused individuals. And so we go back and we talk to folks about how things are going, and one fellow said it was just priceless. He says, I really love living in a building that people walking by think is for millionaires. And I think just that this is not a fancy building. It's well designed, right? But it's not a super extravagant building. We don't have the budgets to design extravagant buildings. We have to figure out how to make the most of the least when we're designing these things. But I think that's just an insight into the fact that a lot of these folks they just need a measure of dignity. They need a measure of stability in their lives. And I think there's one story of one fellow who just one thing led to another. He found himself homeless, then he found himself addicted, and he was an artist, and he stopped doing his art, and then he just one day he heard about this project, and he moved in. It felt like it was part of a community again, and it was a supportive community. People watching out for him, and he started doing his art again, and he's now moved on and is back to living a relatively stable and productive life. So I guess I'm just saying. I mean, I think the part of this conversation, I think, in my mind anyway, is really all about how can individuals take agency in their daily lives. How can you and I or anyone sort of see a problem and not just complain about it or be worried about it or whatever, but actually take action, actually make a difference every single day. And I think as architects and designers, we are blessed because we have the ability to do that. We have the ability to design buildings that have a huge impact on people's lives. And I just, another guy who moved into the Berkeley project I mentioned, he was walking around, and he said, this place I'd never imagined that I'd ever be able to live in a place like this. I kind of feel like I don't deserve it. And like this breaks your heart. It's like, well, yeah. Why not? So I think we can all of these, every single conversation that one might have these days can always devolve into, kind of, the challenges of getting, each half of the divided nation to agree on something. And I guess my only response to that is that, we're not going to convince everyone that it's important to, bring unhoused people off the street and try to give them a chance to have a productive life. They might just say, ship them off to wherever, or as, ship them off to San Francisco. They got plenty of them already. But I think, you're gonna find. I believe strongly enough in the human spirit to know that I think most reasonable people, regardless of their political affiliation, would say, yeah, I think it's a good idea to help people who are homeless, or to provide environments that welcome people who are disabled, rather than just building a stairway that doesn't allow them to go in. Now, certainly the ADA, in that regard, helps get us to a baseline. But but I think part of what our book is about is going beyond the ADA and sort of thinking at no additional cost, thinking about how to make environments that really do welcome everyone off the street. Buildings are great communicators, right? And so you can look at the steps leading up to the Supreme Court in Washington, D.C., the supposedly the court for all the people. And there's, somebody in a wheelchair is going to look at that and say, that's not for me. I can't even get there. So I think
go ahead.
As I was saying, anyway, and I just want to say that I think it's this book is really about trying to sort of say to folks, look, if you're a designer, then why wouldn't you design the most important thing that you have, which is your life and design? And if you want to design your life and design, why would you want to find some way to make beautiful buildings that actually have greater meaning beyond simply their beauty, that help to create an environment that welcomes everyone and shows the way to a better way of living, together with a lower impact on the planet, and a greater impact on the quality of all of our lives. I mean, I think that is something that we as architects are uniquely positioned to participate in, and I think it's very exciting, frankly. I mean, I think I always say, in the history of architecture, there's never been more important time to be an architect.
I kind of feel like we could apply that across just simply being human. We're at the point where we could exterminate ourselves pretty haphazardly and accidentally if we're not careful, with all the technologies coming in online and everything else too. But yeah, it seems to me that you have the situation of drug addiction, medical issues, and mental illness that contribute in a huge way to homelessness. The solution is not to let them die of exposure, and then we won't have those people around anymore. That's a completely heartless and cruel way of dealing with something like that. Now, it seems like at minimum, you have to say, all right, let's get these people in a place where they, first of all, are safe and are not under an immense amount of stress due to just death or threat from other people. And then I think this is where you kind of bring the right into more of your sympathies, is not yours specifically. You might be right or left, don't know. You're in San Francisco, so I don't think they allow anyone on the right there. But anyways, but then you start the conversation with the right. It's like, okay, we've triaged this. We're not letting them die on the streets, and we're giving them a safe place where they can start building towards the behaviors that are going to give these people a better life. Where currently, if we just leave them, they're either going to die or they're going to stay in this cycle of living like this, which is going to be bad for everyone involved. Or, you just let them stay there and die. And that's just not a solution. So bring the right in with more of an idea of like, all right, we've got these people safe, housed, and now how do we start the educational component of how to help these people with the rest of their lives that are causing society to have to take care of them as if they were people who could not take care of themselves, because they're at that point. And I know it's demeaning to say that about someone, but if someone else has to take care of you, you're not taking care of yourself. And that happens to people. That happens to all of us the minute we're born. We all have to have someone take care of us. And somewhere in that existence, from being born to then being booted out of the nest, eventually some of us acquire habits and everything else that turn us towards potentially homelessness. So how do we then include more than just housing situation to protect them in that state, but then how do we help convert these people into contributing members of society and people who aren't going to be hurting themselves or others, or who will degrade the environment and social structure that we have? Because libraries have become an issue that they become more so a homeless shelter than, who needs to go to a library anymore? Do you really need a physical book anymore with an iPad and a computer and the internet? But public spaces like that become safe places, because if you know the statistics around homelessness and everything else, it's a real issue to be out there on the streets, and they get you initially if they see you with a backpack. They know potentially if you look like that and you got a backpack, you're homeless. I can take advantage of you as a homeless person to another homeless person, and no one's really going to care.
Right.
And that's when you start get this predation on each other that makes it so incredibly dangerous for them to exist. Now, moving on to in many ways a darker subject. How do we deal with racial inequality and just simply portions of the population being under-resourced as a means of addressing that through architecture? As the designer or person working with a client, how do you actually bring that into the project to help correct societal norms?
Well, this is as you probably know, is a very hot topic these days. What is justice architecture, and I think I think there are various different attitudes about that are, I think, still evolving. I can speak for myself and say that if you're designing a building that is, let's say it's a community building, or housing for underserved populations, that is welcoming to everyone, visually and physically welcome to everyone, that is able to accommodate and welcome people with a wide variety of ability ranges, etc. Then we've done a lot as architects to help that problem. We're not going to solve racism as architects. That's just not going to happen. Let's be real. But I think, but we can, do our best. So, for example, if you've been tasked to design a community building, make sure that you're talking to the community when you're designing that building. You're bringing the folks who are typically unheard into the table and listening to them carefully and sincerely, and taking their advice about the kinds of spaces that they need. That's where equity inclusion really begins in the architectural process. Try to make sure that if you're involved in site selection, make sure that the building is convenient to mass transit, to public transit, so that folks with lesser means can get there and use it. Try to make sure that it's enlivening a retail area that might otherwise be somewhat dispossessed. Help through architecture, help to revitalize old buildings and old communities. So I think there's no silver bullet here. There's no magic pill. We can't, as architects, we're not going to save the world, but we can create small moments of dignity and order. And I use that word in a positive way, and graciousness for our fellow citizens. But I think in the end of the day, what this book is really all about is sort of saying, look, we live in a big, complicated world, and it's just getting more complicated all the time. And sometimes it just feels overwhelming to you're just inundated every day with bad news about the world. How can we make sense of that? How can we, as individual designers, how can we take some measure of agency in our daily lives, and then I think through design, designing a school that inspires learning in the 21st century, that connects students and their teachers to their natural world all around them, even in the inner city. That's a powerful thing. That's a gift that we have to give to each of those students for generations. And I think that's an enormous opportunity, and it's enormous responsibility, if you look at it that way. I also would add that I think part of the problem with our profession, with design, with architecture, is that I think for too long we've been perceived as this profession of old white guys designing houses for rich people, and I think that's clearly not what we are anymore. But it's certainly, I have a long ways to go to become a more inclusive profession. I think when we become a more inclusive profession, we're going to do that by becoming more relevant in the world. And being more relevant in the world, in my mind, means trying to help our communities deal with some of the serious problems that they're facing through architecture, through great design. And and then when you can do that, I think what that does is it draws more people from a greater diversity of backgrounds. If I'm the parent of a young Black student, and I'm imagining, they're saying, hey, I might want to become an architect, but they're also really good at all this other stuff in school. They say, well, why don't you become an engineer? You'll make a lot more money, and you don't have to, your life will be much more comfortable. Well, why don't we make architecture more attractive to young people of all sorts, to bring them into the profession and bring their perspective, their unique perspectives and their unique creativity to the table? That will become, I think, help us become much more responsive in creating environments that are more equitable and more just, all by itself. So, again, these are all super complicated questions, and I think the fact is that architects are doers. I think by nature we're makers, we're builders. We want to build a better world. I think if you ask any architect, I don't care how cynical they might be, I think you're going to ask a group of them. I think you're going to see 90% of them will answer in some version of, I became an architect because I really want to make a better world. So this is a way to make a better world.
Yeah, that's interesting. I went to architecture school, and the thought was not at the forefront of why I chose to be an architect. I knew that no matter what I did, I should aim at creating a better world, and I felt like architecture was it fit my talents the best. So I had this. I was raised in a, I would say, Christian home that instilled those values that taught me really more so that you have the option to be a doctor, lawyer, teacher, nurse, a little bit more of these direct interaction professions that actually put their hands on a person or directly speak with a person rather than work with a concept that then becomes something in reality, like architecture. You had sparked something in my thinking with your earlier comment. Like, I can imagine myself being in a wheelchair when I go to a gas station and then looking at that curb and being like, if it wasn't the law that there is this curb cut here, this would be a very, it would, not a shameful moment, but like I'd have to look around and see if I can't do it. Can someone help me get up this 6-inch curb here? It's demeaning in a way, especially, for a masculine person to can someone help me? That, and I can put myself in that position empathetically because I've had injuries that have limited me for a time. I can't put myself in the position of a homeless person because I haven't personally had enough experiences that make me able to empathize deeply. I can see the value in the ADA and the ramps, and while the ramps might be unsightly to how some people design them sometimes, I've seen great ones. But just those simple curb cuts, that had to be a law for people to get to do it. And without that, you'd have people rolling off these curbs, falling into traffic and being really uncomfortable. And it's a good thing that we have those. Okay. That's easier because those people are in that position usually because out of no choice of their own. There was no free will involved typically for a person to lose a leg, lose the use of their, and unless they're a motocross person or whatever. But even so, they didn't necessarily get there on their own. I think people lack the empathy when it comes to housing the homeless, at least on the right, because they can't fully, they can't really envision in their heads how they could get there and how they hope that system is there for them in case they fall into that situation. You can do that with the ADA stuff because your grandma might need to wheel up there, or, you can have that empathy pretty easily. But when it comes to drug addiction, mental illness, and the resulting homeless, it's harder for a society to move that along as we have with ADA issues.
I don't know. I mean, I think what you just said it yourself. I think so many of our population are 1 or 2 paychecks away from homelessness, and many folks have suffered, if not themselves, but members of their family have suffered from the opioid crisis, and the challenges that places on an individual to actually be a productive member of society, and so I think, I don't know the answer. I don't know the answer to your question. If your question is, some folks, might not be convinced of the importance of, housing the homeless. They just, similarly, some folks don't believe in, quote unquote, believe in climate change, and some folks don't believe in science. And all I can say is, you're entitled to beliefs. It's a free country, God bless you. But, I do believe in science. I do believe that
Well,
climate change is happening, and I also believe that that people who are down on their luck deserve a hand up, and to get them off the street and to help them on their way. And I think I would be willing to bet again that if you ask folks, if you were able to ask, that's maybe difficult to do in this day and age, but if you're able to ask separate from the 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 constant um, chatter, right left chatter that's going on. If you just got someone, over a cup of coffee and you were talking to them about their values, I think maybe I'm being naive here, but I believe that 90%, 70%, whatever the number is, majority of people, majority of Americans would say, yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense
yeah,
for them. It makes sense for our community. It makes sense for our society as a whole. Let's do it. That's why I think, I mean, I'm reminded of I was years ago, I was driving my son, and we were back east in North Carolina. We were at an athletic event, and we took a break, and we were driving down the highway, listening to AM radio, and the DJ was saying, "Well, I'm sorry, but I'm not going to let anyone stand between me and my God-given right to the three G's: God, guns, and gas." And I said, well, my son, who grew up in San Francisco, said, "Wow, that's pretty extreme." And I said, well, some people feel that way, and I respect that. That's their opinion. But I do think that, if we want to continue to maintain what is even resembles the American way of life, whatever that might be to you, we have to solve the the biggest problems that we're facing as communities. We have to
yeah,
solve the climate crisis. We can't just ignore it and say it's going to go away. We can't just put our heads in the sand and think that somehow if we ignore it, it'll be taken care of by somebody else. No, it's going to be taken care of by each of us individually every day through our actions and through our
mhm,
values. And if we want to address homelessness, we have to do something about that. We can't just sit and wait for somebody else to take care of it, because that's not been working.
yeah,
And similarly, if we want to create environment and educational environments for our kids so that they can be prepared for what is undeniably going to be a challenging, future. Um, what what more could we do than take some action every day in our practice of architecture, to help those ideals move forward. I always say that
mm,
architecture is a values proposition. I don't care what your values are, but somehow the values of your own personal values and the values of your community have to come together, and you create buildings that sort of serve all of that,
mm,
and celebrate those values, and hopefully those values are the best of us, not the worst of us.
yeah. It. I wouldn't. Let's see. I wouldn't say that people would fight. I'm trying to understand. I psychologically, I'm open, and politically I'm left naturally. And I'm trying. I know enough because of who I live with that it's not the full picture. It's half of the picture, and I'm wondering. I always try and wonder, like, what is the other response, and then the pushback on this. And the goal is, in my view, always the same, but the process of how to get there is different often. And it's based in these deeper psychological traits. So it's like, if we can get deep enough to understand that we want the same outcome, how can we offer this solution that pulls from both of our psychologies and both of our understandings together to get the best equitable, balanced, all of us together working towards the same thing future. I'm trying to introduce that into my in the moment thinking to be able to meet opposition to what I find to be true with good information or the humility to change my opinion. Yep. So, and that's a really hard thing. That's like one of those sayings, the wisdom to know what needs to be changed and the courage to do it, or however that one verbally goes together. Well, I've really enjoyed this conversation. You obviously, you've had a lot of time and thought put into this and how to implement these values, these social values primarily into your design practice. I looked through the website of your design firm. You guys do incredible work. And it's good to know that people achieving and capable at your level are also thinking about those who are less fortunate than them. Dare I say, a very Christian ideal to incorporate into your thinking and your business practices. But I would also say that that's probably a pretty common goal for most any spiritual belief system, is to take care of those around you who need it, and not to grab everything you can for yourself and run. So thank you for being that change in the industry and thinking along these lines and taking the time to help me work through these things and to understand them and to think outside the boundaries of where I typically would, being who I am. So I appreciate the time and the person and the firm that you've created.
I think the message, overall message here, just to conclude, is that this is not just a social agenda. I think it's really thinking about, young people today want to know how they can address the climate emergency. They want to know how they can address equity, inclusiveness, and diversity. They want to know how they're going to do all these things in their lives, and I think what we're trying to say is, well, it can be done. We can actually make a living doing this, and it doesn't have to be in San Francisco. It can be anywhere. Just start with your one or two projects that are what you might call mission driven for a community organization or for a nonprofit developer, and see how it goes, and then things can go from there. The first step is to decide that you want to do it, that you want to have greater meaning in your work, greater relevance in your practice, and greater impact through the work that you do every day. So thank you very much, Trent, for this opportunity. I enjoyed the conversation as well.
Well, thank you very much, Bill. Thanks for taking the time to drop in here to Architecture, Design, and Photography. Look forward to seeing, hopefully, more of your work. I try and check back in on architects' websites and everything else and keep them on my radar. So thanks again for taking the time to talk with us, and best of luck.
All right. Same to you. Thank you.